Chapter 2. The English in America. Introduction. In this lecture, we discover why the English got into the colonization business when the Spaniards, the Portuguese, and even the French, great European powers all, already had a long head start and had already claimed and occupied just about every square inch of land worthy of colonization in the New World, and indeed in much of Asia as well. We note the compelling reasons why the most daring and adventurous souls in the England of Queen Elizabeth's day, the England of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser, remained undaunted at the challenge of overseas adventure and colonization, and why so many among England's restless and rowdy legions of ambitious young men and bold chance-takers, whose bawdy presence peopled Shakespeare's plays as much as they crowded the westward-looking wharves of London, eagerly sought the fray, and relished the long odds against them which a colony-making enterprise, they knew, inevitably entailed. We meet the giants among this bold crew of risk-takers, Gilbert, Raleigh, and Drake, and follow their unlikely exploits, which failed as often as they succeeded, but when they succeeded, did so with such panache and boldness that they turned Elizabeth's reign into the Elizabethan era, and planted the English flag like seed corn that grew up to be an empire upon which the sun never set. We learn in this lecture that the English bold thrust into the outer limits of colonial empire had a certain inevitability about it, explainable by what was happening at home. And we learn what those events were which so inexorably propelled the English outward and onward to embrace the idea of worldwide empire on a scale not seen since the Romans. We learn why they could, and why they did, handily defeat, even humiliate, the mighty Spanish Armada, leaving themselves masters of the sea and controllers thereby of their own worldwide destiny, answerable to no one. We watch as one English king, irritated with the Catholic Church in England, just started his own church, the Church of England, made himself pope, took over all the Catholic Church buildings, and converted his subjects' tithes to taxes for his royal treasury. History rarely sees such audacity, even among kings. Even Augustus Caesar, taking upon himself the status of a god, dared not flout the traditional Roman religion to do so. Henry VIII, however, didn't give it a second thought. But that was the English in those days of growing national consciousness, bursting with energy and confidence, ready and eager to take on the world. It was a mindset very much needed to succeed in the colonization business in those days. Still, the English were wise enough to schedule a dress rehearsal first. We watch with as much horror as fascination as they brutally subdue the simple peasants of adjacent Ireland to teach themselves the dark arts of bloody conquest. We note how they learned how to spread the high financial risks of exploration and colonization by inventing the Joint Stock Company. Then we are hugely entertained by the daring exploits of scholar pirates like Humphrey Gilbert and Francis Drake, as these fearless buccaneers take on the mighty Spaniards and their fortress galleons, stealing the Spanish gold, raiding their towns and outposts in the New World, singeing the beard of the Spanish king, as Drake colorfully boasted, and always getting away just in time. Drake, in fact, almost as an afterthought, took the long way home on one of these expeditions and sailed all the way around the world to get back to London. Queen Elizabeth was so impressed that she met him at the wharf and knighted him on the deck of his ship. So that was the spirit of England in the Elizabethan era. Englishmen and Englishwomen had what we call today attitude, and it's a good thing they did, because they would need it to get a foothold in the howling and unforgiving wilderness of North America. We see Walter Raleigh trying and failing, his colonists swallowed up in the dark forests of Virginia, never to be seen or heard from again. We see the beleaguered and hapless adventurers of Jamestown starving to death, down to a few dozen survivors, but cheating the reaper in the end as they rebounded with Spartan tenacity. We also see those same desperate survivors treating their neighbors, the Powhatan Indians, with the same dismissive contempt their English forebears lavished on the helpless dirt farmers of Ireland. Yes, the English were cruel until they could afford to be kind, and then they were just condescending. And speaking of the Indians, we take a trip in this lecture also into their world at large, noting what they did to try and survive the threat of the white man. Like Custer at Little Bighorn, they often fought to the last man, and they traded cruelty for cruelty with the English in the end. They had no chance in the end, but they fought as if they did. Eventually, their ancient cultures were confined to a series of footnotes in the fat book of English history. Meantime, His Majesty's southern colonists found the slippery El Dorado for which so many Spanish conquistadores had died in the previous century, when John Rolfe delivered Virginia into a new promised land of prosperity by discovering a variety of tobacco that would grow like a weed in the New World to sate the nicotine cravings of Europeans in the Old. The American South bounded into existence, and we hadn't even got to 1700. Up north, the New Englanders, so emotionally tied to their mother country that they could not bring themselves to give their own piece of howling wilderness any other name than that which graced their timeless sceptred isle at home, were busy carving out their own unique existence, which eventually became so culturally at variance with that of the stalwart survivors of Virginia that they had to fight a civil war 200 years later just to coexist with their English brethren on the same continent, sprawling and limitless though it was. We follow the whole story in this lecture: the evolution of town meetings and self-government, the experiments with indentured servants and slavery, the differences between the royal, proprietary, and independent colonies, what the King of England was doing back home all this time, the experiments with religious toleration, the Pilgrims, and John Winthrop and his Puritans, the outcasts, the rebels, the Crusaders, the Catholics, and what was happening in the Caribbean. Yes, the English colonists were there too. Even their famous pirates were there, like the celebrated John Hawkins, tugging at the beard of the Spanish king, trying to be like Francis Drake. And during all of this tumultuous and dramatic hurly-burly, the English at home even took the time to have their own civil war along with their tea and crumpets, and beheaded their king, and tried another form of government, then finally came back to their ancient monarchy. Their loyal subjects in the American colonies read all about it in the paper and thought it was a great shame if they were businessmen, or a welcome purge if the former king had been the cause of driving them out of England in the first place. Through all of this roller coaster history in both the New World and the Old during this early formative time period, we can see, if we look carefully, the first glimmers of what became the United States of America about 100 years later. You will take a trip, in this lecture, through each colony, one at a time, and learn how they were different and what they had in common, and how together they became the underlying fabric which held together the fledgling new country when the Founding Fathers finally launched that bold experiment. This is the lecture which explains the historical roots of your country.